Hello everyone! So today we are going to be continuing our Empires A to Z series by looking at a scenario where Australia forms an empire. Australia is a country comprising the mainland of the Australian continent in Oceania. This island nation is considered mega diverse, with wetlands and tropical rainforests in the north, subtropical forests and plains along the coasts in the east and west, semi-arid grasslands along the interior, temperate land in the extreme southeast and southwest, the extremely hot desert, also known as the Outback, in the far interior, and Tasmania, which is a small island consisting primarily of temperate forest. It has a population of over 27 million people, and it's the 13th largest economy in the world. It is estimated that the first Aboriginal Australians arrived to the continent roughly 50 to 60,000 years ago, via migration from former land bridges and short sea crossings from what is now Southeast Asia. The first Europeans to discover Australia were the Dutch in 1606. The first British expedition to the island came in 1770, as James Cook sailed the eastern coast and claimed the eastern half of the continent, New South Wales, for Britain. Following the loss of its penal colony Georgia in the American Revolutionary War, Great Britain established the first permanent settlement in Australia at Sydney in 1788. While many early settlers were convicts, the colony would soon attract people from across the British Empire. By 1827, the British expanded their claim to include the western half of the continent, and 6 other colonies were carved from the island's territory. Throughout the second half of the 19th century, the colonies gained self-governance and would federate in 1901 as the Commonwealth of Australia. Australia was a major participant in both world wars and helped found the League of Nations, as well as its successor, the United Nations. Following World War II, Australia saw an immigration and economic boom as millions immigrated from war-torn Europe to the mostly spared southern continent. During the Cold War, Australia was part of the Western Bloc that sided with the United States in Western Europe, a relationship that continues to this day. In 1986, the Australia Act severed the final governmental tie between the United Kingdom and Australia while retaining the British monarch. Since, Australia has maintained its close relations with the United Kingdom and the other Commonwealth realms, as well as proving to be an important ally to the United States as a counter to Chinese influence in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Now, Australia is a highly developed nation with a technologically advanced military. There isn't much for me to fix, so that means I can pretty much go straight on to the scenario. However, there is one thing that I am going to do to help our scenario later. I'm going to have Australia double down on its efforts to get off of coal and other fossil fuel-based energy production by focusing on building a more robust energy transmission network and shifting harder into solar and wind energy. With that ongoing, let's get this scenario started. As the years progress, China sets its sights on Oceania. This primarily occurs in Papua New Guinea and East Timor, as both nations join China's Belt and Road Initiative to grow their nations. This results in both nations taking large predatory loans that they cannot afford and inviting Chinese influence further into the region. It doesn't take long before East Timor and Papua New Guinea fail to pay on their loans, and China forces them to host Chinese military bases. Seeing this as a regional security threat, Australia issues an ultimatum demanding that the Papuan and Timorese governments rescind their agreements to the Chinese, but both are forced to refuse. Australia then declares war on both nations, commencing the East Malay War. Australia begins the war by dropping paratroopers at Bissau in East Timor to take the mostly abandoned airfield. The airfield is immediately made operational, and a small group of reinforcements is brought in. The Australian troops push west, and after a limited engagement, they take the capital of Dili, and East Timor capitulates within a few days. While the attack in East Timor was beginning, so was the attack on Papua New Guinea. Taking advantage of the much smaller Papuan army, Australia lands at and takes the capital of Port Moresby. It follows this up with separate landings at Lae, Buka, and Madang. As the Australian forces fan out along the coast, the Papuan military disintegrates as it cannot defend the country. With its defenses crumbling, Papua New Guinea capitulates and a peace conference is held in Darwin to bring the East Malay War to an end. Australia annexes the majority of East Timor for itself, while giving Indonesia the region of Oyakuse, in exchange for stabilizing the border on the Lowes River. In Papua New Guinea, Australia replaces the government with one more sympathetic to Australia and settles the nation's debt with China. This effectively turns Papua New Guinea into an Australian puppet state. Going back to before the East Malay War, Australia's new energy policies were already a big hit with the smaller island nations around the South Pacific. With Chinese influence now checked in the region, Australia's popularity among the members in the Pacific Islands Forum leads to it becoming the forum's chair and occupying the Secretary General's seat at the same time. With this accomplished, Australia begins using its newfound influence to evolve the forum into a union of Pacific nations. This passes in all nations, except for Fiji and New Zealand, leading to the creation of the Pacific Union. As the Pacific Union was created, the nations of Fiji and New Zealand refrained from joining. This was no surprise to the members of the Union, as these two nations were always seen as the primary opposition to Australia on many issues. As Australia and the other members of the Pacific Union begin preparing for threats to the West, a secret pact to dismantle the Union is made between Fiji and New Zealand. Funding and weapons make their way to anti-Union radical groups in the Solomon Islands. The largest cell destroys a Qantas Airways passenger plane on the tarmac at Honiara International Airport with an RPG. Union peacekeepers respond and raid a camp on the west side of the Solomon Islands capital, which results in evidence pointing back to Fiji and New Zealand. Australia and other members of the Pacific Union see this as an attack on a Union member and declare war on Fiji and New Zealand, beginning the Uncharted War. With Australian naval support, Union forces take the small Samoan port town of Lautoka and secure the nearby town of Nadi. The majority of the island of Fiji falls within a matter of days, but most of the Fijian military has fallen back to Suva, turning the capital into a fortress. In brutal street-to-street fighting, Union forces push through the capital defenses and Fiji capitulates. While Union forces were fighting in Fiji, Australia focused on New Zealand. Australian forces make two landings, the first on North Island at Napier and the second on South Island at Nelson. The forces take Nelson and the surrounding area before pushing east to cut off the possibility of reinforcements from across the Cook Strait. From there, the attack on South Island pushes south and surrounds Christchurch. Back on North Island, the Australian force there expands their foothold on the east coast before pushing south. They advance and cut off the capital of Wellington before pushing in and taking the city. The South Island force takes Christchurch and then secures the rest of the island. Forces from Wellington turn back north and counter the majority of the remaining New Zealand Defence Force that were coming to relieve the capital. A small battle ensues, and the New Zealanders are routed back north. The Australians continue their push and take Hamilton before pushing on to take Auckland. New Zealand capitulates, and the peace conference is held in Sydney. In the peace deal, a new pro-Union government is installed in Fiji, while New Zealand is annexed by Australia directly. Following the end of the Uncharted War, a period of peace descends on the Pacific Union. The Union uses this to begin initiatives that build up and strengthen larger islands, reversing erosion while also providing new possibilities for housing. Other initiatives provide opportunities for relocation to Australia and its puppet of Papua New Guinea. This has the added benefit of helping centralize resources and people, leading to a more efficient economy. This causes the newest government in Indonesia to look upon Oceania as a region of opportunity and claims that Indonesia has a rightful claim to all of Melanesia, including the entirety of the islands of New Guinea and Timor. Australia refutes this, causing an increase of tensions in the region. Indonesia declares war on Australia and immediately sends units across the borders on Timor and New Guinea. Caught mostly unaware, Australia rapidly evacuates the island of Timor and begins a hasty retreat on New Guinea to focus on the more inhabited areas. The majority of the Indonesian Navy sails into the Arafura Sea and destroys a portion of the Australian fleet, giving them control of the northwestern coast of Australia. Indonesia follows this up with a seaborne invasion of Darwin, which takes the city and forces the Australians to create a defensive line northwest of Katherine. Indonesian units pushing on New Guinea take the town of Wewak and Madang before Union reinforcements arrive to stop the advance. Utilizing its Commonwealth status, Australia convinces Singapore and Malaysia to join the conflict on their side. This not only opens another front, but also serves to cut off Indonesia from critical Asian markets. Malaysian troops push into southwestern Borneo to take the city of Pontianak before pushing to the east to take Banjarmasin. Singapore and Malaysia then combine their navies to begin harassing Indonesia's remaining naval presence in the Java Sea. This forces Indonesia to split its navy deployed in the east to cover the crucial supply lines closer to home. With the Indonesian navy stretched thin, the Australian Air Force sinks the remaining ships in the Timor and Anafor Seas, allowing the Australian Navy to cut off supply to the Indonesian army stranded at Darwin. The Australian army goes on the offensive and retakes Darwin, while destroying the Indonesian defenders in the process. Pacific Union troops begin to push back the Indonesian units on New Guinea to retake Madang and Wewak on the north coast. Singapore and Malaysia place anti-ship missile batteries on the southern coast of Borneo and destroy more of the Indonesian fleet in the Java Sea. With crucial setbacks on land and at sea, the Indonesian populace begins to protest for the war to come to a close, but the government refuses. Australia's navy goes on the offensive and moves into the Banda Sea, cutting off the Indonesian forces on New Guinea. Union forces push and take the towns of Jayapura, Nabire, and Sorong, before Indonesia's remaining forces on the island surrender. As supplies dwindle among Indonesia's remaining islands, the people begin to riot. The government attempts to crack down harshly, but rebellion begins to spread through the island chain. Australia begins funneling weapons and goods to rebel groups in the Lesser Sunda Islands, Molucca Islands, and Sulawesi, while Singapore and Malaysia funnel weapons into Sumatra. With proper supply and equipment, the rebel groups gain the upper hand on the various islands, and the Indonesian military is overwhelmed. Australia mounts an invasion of Timor and is welcomed back as liberators. Australia follows this up with a bloodless conquest of the southern Maluku Islands. The Indonesian government is toppled by a combined military-civilian coup, and the new government sues for peace. The peace conference is held in Singapore, where Indonesia dismantles itself. The island of Sumatra gains its independence as the Republic of Sumatra. The island of Java gains its independence as the Kingdom of Sunda. The Flores Republic is formed of several islands in the Lesser Sunda Island chain. The entirety of Sulawesi is turned into the Republic of Goa. The northern two-thirds of the Molucca Islands gain their independence as the Moluccas. Singapore gains the Riau Archipelago and the Bangka Belitung Islands. Malaysia gains all of Indonesia and Borneo. Papua New Guinea is given all of Western New Guinea and renames itself the Republic of New Guinea. Australia gains all of Timor, as well as the southern Maluku Islands. All of the new nations are invited and join the Pacific Union, except for the Kingdom of Sunda. With Indonesia now dismantled, Australia and the Pacific Union are able to live in relative peace. Over the next several decades, Australia and the Pacific Union nations would slowly integrate together to form one nation, focused on trade and defense of the resource-rich region. But that's a scenario for another day, as this will do it for Australia. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and if you would, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and tell me what you think of this Australian empire by leaving a comment below. Anyways, I'll see you next time as we turn Austria into an empire in Empires A to Z.